Signore e signori, benvenuti al MASI e all'AC per una nuova puntata di questa nostra nuova serie che in collaborazione con Fondazione IBSA, MASI e il LAC, come sapete già da anni abbiamo questa collaborazione che, ci tengo a dire, ovviamente va molto oltre queste serate che conoscete. La Fondazione IBSA comunque uno dei principali, più importanti sponsor anche del museo, bisogna anche dire questo forse ogni tanto, quindi grazie anche per questo. Welcome to our guests. We are thrilled to have with us here tonight Ed Atkins. Sono sicuro che avete riscontrato l'opera di Ed Atkins. You've been quite present around here. Ci sono state delle mostre a Zurigo, Kunsthalle, Bregenz, forse alcuni hanno visto. Torino c'è stata una grande mostra di recente, penso. And Ed is currently preparing a major retrospective which will be held at Tate Britain, next year. So I will not do any interpretation or what his work has got to do with science. This will be the talk to put this in focus. Mike Sperlinger is here, so we have a very competent man to do this conversation and to get us to the core of its artistic practice. Mike Sperlinger is head of program for the Office of Contemporary Art in Norway. He's a writer and curator, and he was previously a professor of writing and theory at the Oslo Academy of Fine Art. Welcome also, Mike. And finisco con un ringraziamento ovviamente non solo alla Fondazione IBSA Silvia Misiti, ma ovviamente ringrazio tutte le colleghe del MASI, il Dipartimento Comunicazione, che ci ha aiutato tanto a preparare questa serata, Selin Muschietti che ha organizzato l'evento e ovviamente ringrazio le curatrici, ci sono Francesca Benini soprattutto e Taisse Grandi Venturi che si occupano del contenuto scientifico di questi programmi. Grazie mille e passo la parola volentieri a Silvia.
Grazie direttore, io vi saluto, grazie di essere sempre qui, quindi parto anch'io dai ringraziamenti, quindi grazie di seguirci sempre, sono eventi particolari, cerchiamo di portare personaggi, artisti che sono molto conosciuti ovviamente nell'ambiente più artistico, ma come anche obiettivo quello della Fondazione IBSA è quello un po' di allargare il proprio pubblico. Noi siamo un po' più scienziati e quindi cerchiamo di in qualche maniera portare anche persone che seguono normalmente attività scientifiche in un altro ambiente, in un museo e a vedere realtà diverse. Questo è il secondo evento di quest'anno. Abbiamo avuto in maggio Jacob Stensen, che è stata una bellissima conversazione molto interessante e questo fa parte del progetto, come diceva il direttore, di SciArt Switzerland. Abbiamo chiamato questo progetto proprio SciArt, quindi scienza e arte. Cerchiamo di identificare e invitare con l'aiuto delle curatrici e del MASI artisti che spaziano già in un ambiente scientifico e utilizzano o comunque si ispirano nel mondo scientifico. Alcuni lavorano in luoghi scientifici oppure sono a loro tematiche, come vedremo stasera. Quindi da parte mia un grazie, ringrazio partendo dai miei colleghi Sara Comodo e Jacopo Crespi, che sono del team della Fondazione IBSA che fa tutto questo lavoro, insieme al team e alle colleghe nominate dal direttore. Ormai sono una squadra molto consolidata, lavorano benissimo, noi potremmo anche non esserci. Buona serata a tutti e a questo punto Ed, Mike, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for coming. And yeah, lots of thank yous to everyone involved in putting this together. And thank you to Mike as well for talking to me.
Yeah, no, so yeah, just to reiterate, thank you so much to IBSA Foundation and MASI Lugano for having us. It's a great privilege to be here. It's a great privilege to be with Ed. Ed is an artist who I've admired for 15 years, and I would say is also a friend. So we've been in conversation, I would say, for at least a decade about different things. Ed, I'm not going to do we agreed not a big CV intro for him. I think you actually have a very nicely printed biography. Just to say that some of his recent exhibitions have included at the New Museum in New York, at the Tank in Shanghai, at the Stedelijk in Amsterdam, at Castello de Rivoli, and, as was mentioned, this very exciting upcoming retrospective, I guess we could say, at Tate Britain next spring. We're going to be in conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open, hopefully, to some questions from you. And I want to just start by saying we're here with gratitude, and also, I think, at least on my part, with a certain embarrassment in terms of the relationship to art and science. So I don't feel I have any authority to speak on that. And I think what we're going to do is, in a way, start from a kind of much smaller set of questions, rather than around science, maybe more around technology, and around a particular subset of technologies which have been important to Ed's practice, around simulation and game engines. And what we're going to do is we're going to try, rather than kind of go through lots of images of works that you don't get a taste of, we're going to focus really on 2 or 3 works. We're going to show you some clips, and we're going to talk a bit about them, and try and think a little bit about not just the works as they appear, but also the kind of very complex processes and negotiations and frictions that are involved in producing them. Ed, maybe we could start. Like, I think we're going to look at 3 works that they have certain things in common, but they're quite different in their own ways. But they all share a certain technology, which is the Unreal Engine.
Yes.
Do you want to just say something about that, about what first attracted you to that, and maybe what it is, even to start with?
Yeah. So it's before I press play on things that will kind of heckle us throughout. To say this is a video game engine called Unreal, which is most famously used to make video games, but it's also been used to make 3D sort of experiences, whatever that entails, really. There's a whole kind of panoply of things that Unreal is increasingly used for, including TV and cinema and all of these kinds of things. But for me, it was its relationship to video games and to a certain kind of liveness. So prior to using this video game engine, which, if you imagine, is just a way to make a kind of computer-generated version of anything and simulate the ways in which that world interacts with itself. Prior to this, I would do a lot of computer-generated animation kind of offline. So it's basically like animation, but using a computer and using 3D rendered images and objects. And this kind of revelation to me was to do with the fact that it's liveness, the fact that it happens. So if you think of a game, when you start it up, it plays. It has its own duration, its own sense of time, but things happen more or less live, rather than like cinema, where you would film something, another thing, you can edit it, you can kind of piece it together. But this first piece that we're going to look at is called Refuse, or Refuse. The title is a homonym or a homophone, as in it's a word that is only resolved when you say it out loud. So in English, refuse or refuse, as in trash or to say no to something. And this was a piece that was originally sort of half commissioned by Performer, which is a festival in New York. And originally, maybe interestingly, and we can touch on this, it was meant to be a live piece for theatre, a kind of play. Budget kind of came in the way of that, and it became a computer-generated thing. But potentially more interestingly, because of this, because essentially it's about the simulation of physics, what happens when you tell a computer algorithmically the weight of an object, the way that it interacts with other objects, this kind of thing. But maybe I'll just sort of press go on it, and we can control the volume, because you'll see, maybe we'll just start. Hopefully I've clicked the right button again. Here we go. So it's still vestigially a piece of theatre, essentially. But my idea was to kind of boil drama and theatre down to its kind of essential elements. Yes. So what you're going to see is a series of things falling onto a stage and slowly accumulating into a big pile. But what's interesting is that this is not a... So what you're looking at now is a capture of a piece of software. So in reality, when it's installed, it's different every time. So it begins with a bed. The sequence of objects that falls is always the same, but the way that they interact, the way that the pile accumulates, the way that the software tries to simulate each of the objects and the ways in which they meet each other. Maybe we can turn it down just a little bit, just while we try and talk about it. But in a way, this was also born out of a fascination with video games, essentially, as their own form, as a completely separate thing, a thing that essentially is trying to increasingly and as well as possible simulate reality. So this is made in as I said, the Unreal Engine. Unreal Engine 4, which is the previous generation of this. But it includes essentially, a model, say, of an anchor, and you would tell the software what that weighs, how it interacts with other things, and within each of the models are embedded a series of sound effects that are triggered when it touches things. But most importantly, it's simulated. It's not programmed. So it basically creates the circumstances for an accident and then simulates it. So it's not that each thing is carefully animated or chosen. The only things that are chosen are the objects. And everything else, the way that they interact, the way that they form, is not. Sorry, I could rant about the constitution of this thing, but yeah.
No, it's great, because I think what we wanted to try and get to with this piece a little bit is that you might encounter this, and you might see this as we're showing it, which is a video that's quite linear, but actually, I think you could spend a long time in the gallery with this, seeing it's roughly 15 minutes, I think, the cycle. Is that right? Or was it longer?
It's about half an hour. Yeah.
Half an hour. Okay.
Yeah.
And you would see something at least slightly different every time.
Yes.
And so in that sense, what we're looking at is actually, like we talked earlier, it's a bit like a score, in a way, like a musical score. So the score, in a way, would be, what would compose the score, do you think? Like it's the list of objects, firstly?
Yes. It's the list of objects, and then and then telling the software what each of those objects sort of is, in terms of the way that we understand them in reality. So telling the system that an anchor weighs this much. So when it hits something else, a mattress, for example, which you've already told weighs this much, and you've told it about the kind of biases of the way that the sound would trigger each time things meet. But necessarily, it's also a kind of stress test of the software in a way. It's deliberately trying to kind of force accident and error within the software. So, for example, you can already see that there is something called clipping going along. And clipping is basically where 3D objects that are meant to be discrete start to kind of overlap. Because obviously what you're looking at really is just code. It's not a real thing at all. So every single element of it, including the haze, as you further look back towards the back of the stage, all of these things are not real. So a lot of the sculpting of the thing is exactly what Mike said, is a score, essentially. It's like you tell it everything, as much as you possibly can about each of the objects, and then you press go. And it sort of plays itself. You think of it like a video game that plays itself, but the kind of dumbest video game, the most basic thing that's meant to sort of be as prosaic as possible as well, which was always a kind of big part of my interest in using computer-generated stuff, was that at least the received idea of it as a kind of spectacular thing, or as something that is for fantasy or for superheroes or whatever, or for video games, for a certain kind of, spectacularness, was to sort of force it to do kind of, not banal thing. I mean, this thing is kind of relatively spectacular, but it's also, it has this kind of pointlessness to it. It has a sort of trash, for want of a better term, yeah.
And maybe it's important to say, like, because you mentioned, you know, this had a very long gestation, this project.
Yes.
So it began, as you were saying, with the idea that this could literally happen as a stage production, so like a theatre play.
Yeah.
So real curtains would open,
Yes.
real objects would fall. But you said, so you had a lot of conversations with theatres about stages, how much they were reinforced, whether you could drop a car on them, this kind of thing.
Exactly.
But when we get to this point, when this is not you sitting alone in the studio making this. This is, in a way, a negotiation with a team of programmers and people who are specialists in Unity. Can you say a bit about that? Because I think to go back to what you were saying about the limits that we start to see in the video, and you mentioned, for an example, actually, of the bricks. Of just that, like, the interest that you had in actually testing, not just using this to do something spectacular, but actually testing the limits of what this software can do.
Yeah. So there were a lot of solutions. You know, this thing is fraught with error. You know, and there are lots of errors that happen when you program something like this. And again, I am not the person that programmed this thing. I'm the kind of the person that conceived it and wanted to find these limits. You hit constantly elements where the whole system crashes or where something doesn't work, because this starts to be an unmanageable amount of things happening on the screen at any one time. And if you've ever played a game on a PC with not a very good graphics card or something, you'll know it starts to stutter, the frame rate starts to break down. So there were certain cheats that we had to do in order for it to work. So for example, at the beginning, when this sort of unimaginable amount of bricks fall, it turned out that we had to kind of spawn them from the ground instead and hide the fact that there weren't that many bricks falling at all. Or at certain points, some of the objects transform from 3D objects into essentially bitmaps, so they become flat. Because there's a locked-off camera for this entire thing, and as soon as you have too many polygons happening at any one time, so these skulls, for example, these bones that fall, some of them are not actually falling or interacting, they are just sort of set dressing in some way. So there's always a desire, what do I want to see? And of course, part of that is I want it to be an accident. I want it to break or get right up close to this sort of problem, you know, at the heart of using this kind of software, asking it to do things that it doesn't want to do. I think that's kind of a central idea.
Just to go back to that, like, because you also said we, and so it wasn't just you asking the software, you were asking the programmers to do things. Like, can you just say a bit about that relationship? Like, was that something that they enjoyed? Was it a very frustrating experience for them to be asked to do things that, in a way, would break the thing that they were trying to build for you? What was the process?
It was a mixture. Like? It was a mixture of, you know, usually there's a first, whenever I work with real professionals, I assume myself as a kind of amateur, really, or a prosumer. Is an old term. There's an excitement because they're doing something that they would never usually do. But then there's also a profound frustration in the fact that, at least professionally, they really want to make everything as slick and as kind of perfect as possible, to not fail. I remember very early days of using computer-generated software. I went to a company in Soho in London because I wanted some fire. I wanted some really good CG fire, but I wanted it to be not that good. I wanted it to be a bit shit, because I kind of always wanted it to no one to ever forget that this thing was profoundly artificial in some way. And it was met with kind of a blank stare, really, essentially, of like, why would you want this? Why would you? Because essentially effects and CGI is always trying to disappear. It always wants to become invisible to a certain extent. And so there was this kind of constant push and pull where they would spend ages trying to solve a problem, which in the end I quite liked. I quite liked the fact that, I don't know, for example, a skull would just sort of hover in midair and freeze there. Or, you know, at a certain point, the whole software wouldn't run unless there was a fish off screen rotating. And no one knew why, and we talked to the people who actually made the game engine themselves, and they couldn't tell you why. If you remove this fish from, I think it's sort of here, just rotating, if you took that fish away, the whole thing would crash. So somehow it was dependent on these kind of ludicrous logic to the system, but for everyone, including the experts, kind of unavailable nonsense of like, okay, there's this impossible situations of surreal stuff that has to be happening in order for it to function somehow, which was fascinating, you know, to me. Yeah.
But it seems very important just to, because I think we'll come back to that, but it's a feature, not a bug for you, that sense of like, in a way, that it works just, and you don't even understand why, that's not something that's a concern. In a way, it's like a pleasure, almost, of like using this technology to the point where even the people that designed it don't understand what's happening.
I think a lot of it stems from this sort of my desire to have a sort of found object, a sort of relationship to something that I find rather than design. So you design as little as possible and then press go, or you allow. And in this, it's the system that kind of simulates reality, and in works that we'll look at in a minute, it's reality itself as a kind of problem, a problem of accident and of just liveness. You know, and yeah, I think with this, you know, the very first time I showed this in New York, at the opening, full of lots of lovely people, it just crashed, and you had the kind of Windows desktop just suddenly on these screens, because essentially it is just running. It's a game, and it crashed, and it took 45 minutes to get it working again. So all these people at this lovely art opening, just standing there with glasses of wine, staring at a blue screen, waiting for it to do something. But no one, and again, no one knew why it crashed. It just did, because that's part of the kind of stoicism of engaging with this technology, is that you kind of allow it to, I don't know, it'll fuck up. It'll just do its thing. And you sort of are leaning into that, which is something I'm really interested in, because it also mirrors reality in a way that is uncontrollable. You know, like, I think even in the first conversation we ever did together, I always remember like talking about how a body betrays itself. For example, like there is this sense of, I'm trying to be coherent in front of you all, but maybe my leg hurts, or I burp, or something. You know, like these things that are kind of moments of sabotage from reality somehow. And in this, like for example, there's a monitor here that's just sort of spasming away. And because it's sort of trapped in some, I don't know what, you know, there's not really the language to describe this, because you'd already have to presume to understand the coding of this thing. Or there's a skull there that's just sort of, well, many things that are just floating and being strange. So it's constantly also pulling you out of how convincing it is as real, but also insisting on itself somehow. You know.
There's lots we could talk about with this piece. I do want to ask you, before we look at the other kind of part of the other screen of it, just actually about the score itself, about the objects.
Yeah.
Like, is it possible to describe in a way that, is there a logic to this score? Like, we've seen quite a lot of it play through now. We've seen this list of objects fall. You know, in the middle, for example, there's a moment where a black cat falls with two mirrors, which kind of smash,
yeah,
which seems significant. But what could you just say something about how you're devising that score and the?
I mean, honestly, it came from a lot of writing and interest in lists, and the kind of arbitrariness and precision of lists. These two things feeling so exciting together. You know, that a list of items has this kind of, I don't know, a very quotidian part to it, but then there's also a guided kind of principle. It's like the lowest form of programming or something, you know. And also this desire, like I said, to kind of, I'll just shift on to the next, the upper screen, but this desire to see, to not necessarily have a reason behind these objects, but to rather be sort of interested in their interaction and their arbitrariness. So there's always a difficulty there of trying to embrace accident while having to really overly design it, you know. So in a way, part of the accident comes from not knowing. I don't know how this software works, and I couldn't do it alone. But then asking people to do things with it who are very experienced in making video games or interactive experiences for various things, to do something that is kind of quite sabotaging of their own language, you know, their own. I mean, for example, you know, in the lower screen, when things sort of slow down and it sort of ramps up and the physics kind of dissolve, it's a symptom of the fact that this upper screen, where you just see things falling. So when it's installed, this upper screen would be on a floor upstairs, and then the lower screen would be on the ground floor. And I wanted, when things fall through, for it to slow down in the middle as they pass. But because the upper screen and the lower screen are both the same game running itself, when you slow down the upper, it slows down the lower as well. So you end up with this time dilation, which also affects the physics. So, I mean, it's incredibly sophisticated, and as much as like you can't just slow down time and expect gravity to still function the same. So it does this sort of swelling kind of thing, and you know, that was a complete accident of just a desire meeting the factual accuracy wanted by the software, you know.
And it sort of takes us into this, in a way, the logic of a design engine like Unity, which is world building, right? Which is that it's designed to build games
Unreal,
which
yeah.
Unreal, sorry.
No.
Which are coherent, in which you know, something that happens in one part of the world will cohere with another. But in a way, when you use that tool, you're bound by that logic. So,
yes.
Like you said, you couldn't have something happen on the upper screen that wouldn't affect the lower one.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, this is something that Mike and I have talked about a long time, as kind of not massively people that play video games that much as I'd like to, but just fascinated by it as a culture, but also as a system that, you know, by dint of the size of the number of people playing these games, constantly exposing the faults in, you know, multi-million-dollar productions. So there's some great YouTube channels, for example, of just like clips of video games going completely haywire. There's a favorite series, because a lot of the games made by a company called Ubisoft, which are these kind of big open world games, Assassin's Creed, for example, they're so big and there's so many moving parts in them, it's inevitable that things go wrong. But sometimes the things that go wrong, they're always completely unexpected. And I have a favorite clip, which is like your protagonist is riding on a camel, and then the camel's neck suddenly just sort of elongates to this impossible dimension, and the figure is sort of catapulted into the sky. And it just sort of, this relationship between a kind of immersiveness of like, okay, yes, I'm in this world and I'm really, and then the hard interruption and the break of what that is. And I think that feeling is something I've chased for a very long time, of like being pushed and pulled back and forth in relation to this thing that is trying so hard to just do something that we take for granted, like gravity. You know, it's like, that's crazy, I think, you know.
It makes me think, I think I have one really science-related thought in relation to this talk, which is, I was thinking when I watched this again this morning that Lorraine Daston, who I'm sure some people here will know, is an incredible historian of science, and she was writing recently about this, citing another historian actually, but that in a way Galileo was lucky when he started to think about the kind of gravity and free fall, because in a way it's at a certain level of abstraction, that's a problem you can solve if you simplify. But if he'd thought about something like this in terms of turbulence and air movement, actually that's an almost insoluble problem still, like it's mathematically so complex. So it's like there's something, I think you get something of that here. It's like this game engine has to work at a level of abstraction and simplification, and the pleasure in a way is watching the way that it then diverges from the real world at some point, however.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I think part of that is quite reliant on my own ignorance, you know, like that I am not a programmer, and I'm not like all over Unreal. I mean, I could probably, you know, whatever. I couldn't program this thing or decode it, but to interact with it is a bit like interacting with reality. It's just that the limit is much closer. So you can ask it to do, like for example, in earlier works of mine, just getting someone to drink some liquid was astronomically difficult, because there is no liquid, there is no mouth, there's nothing. You know, you're just sort of having to fake the entire thing. But still, within the liquid, you have the physics of a certain viscosity and of a certain position and all of this sort of stuff. But the thing that it's going into, it's not going into anything. You know, all of these things, and it beautifully, it makes a kind of metaphoric sort of. Suddenly, all of this figurative possibility starts to emerge of like. You know, in a way, these works all start to feel allegorical because they're not real, because they have this kind of parabolic relationship to reality. They feel like, oh, well, they must be telling us something, you know, about our reality by the fact that they're failing to emulate it or something.
Yeah.
You know.
But maybe that's a good moment actually to move to look at the other two works we were going to focus on. So I think they bring us at this from quite a different angle.
Yeah.
I wonder actually if we should just maybe watch a couple of minutes of The Worm.
Yeah.
if that's okay. Like, so there's the next video is a piece called The Worm from 2021, I believe.
Yeah.
The whole thing's about 12 minutes, I believe, or 12, 13 minutes. But maybe if we just give you, you can play it by ear. And if we could put the sound back up and we could just watch the first.
And just to set it up, this was, and trying to not be too long-winded about it, this was a commission working with Bell Labs, which is a very long-standing American telephone thing, now Nokia. But they used to have a thing in collaboration with artists in the 60s and 70s called EAT, and they tried to rejuvenate it in asking artists, and I was the sort of first artist to work again with Bell Labs to try and do something. The collaboration, I think, in the end, made an extraordinary piece of work, but the collaboration itself was very difficult. And I think, just as an aside, it's interesting to note, you know, for me, breaking technology and proving its failures, or its insufficiencies, rather, is where it's really interesting. Whereas, of course, if you're a communications company, you're constantly trying to do the opposite. So there was this real antagonistic relationship, which in the end was really productive discursively. But when it comes to the actual work, it ended up being a tricky process. But essentially, this is me. I went, in the middle of the pandemic, I went and sat in a hotel room in Berlin wearing a full motion capture suit, which is basically a kind of lycra thing with sensors on all the important joints, and a sort of helmet thing with a camera here, dots all over my face. You know, really what you would imagine from a behind the scenes of Lord of the Rings or something. But I just called my mum instead. So again, it was this sort of like this technology of extraordinary kind of construction and artifice, and then asking it to document something. And it became important to me to think of these as kind of documentaries in the most obscene way, just to document something strange. I edited it. This is not a live rendering. This is not a video game. It's using the same engine, Unreal, to create the 3D. Let's we'll have a little look at it and see some.
Yeah. 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 Yep. Cool. All right. Please work.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry, Mum.
I'd be doing it in the bathroom at some point in the day in my own time, and then walk downstairs and be this old man, you know. That's an alert, isn't it?
It's okay.
Okay. Well, and it was really to get some sort of response, I suppose, but also to maybe become another completely different character.
Yeah.
I think maybe I wasn't very happy. But over time, I would gradually buy other things like moustaches and nose putty.
Yeah.
And
Quite elaborate.
And then one day, Mum said, "Why don't you go and knock on next door and ask them for pretend that you're collecting for Mersey missions to seamen?" And they didn't really completely understand that it was me. So I got away with it for a little while. Yeah, I know. I just didn't feel at all as if there was any promise, you know, in becoming, I suppose, eventually lovable.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be in tears in a minute.
I'm sorry, Mum.
No, it's all, I don't mind, because the main thing is that we acknowledge things.
Yeah.
And it's not new. These are not new thoughts.
Turn the
I
volume
still
down.
have the deep
Yeah.
amount of confidence.
But
in my
this interest in
ability or desire
in liveness, what that is. I mean, I suppose the fascination with this kind of realistic computer animation was always, what kind of reality is it trying to emulate? What is it missing? What is it failing to capture? You know, what is the feeling of this? And obviously there is a kind of long-standing discourse around the uncanny, you know, in as much as there is something kind of heretical about seeing something trying very hard to be a real living thing. And particularly if you ask it to document without, you know, without compensation, the failures of language, the failure to communicate. I mean, I'm on the phone with my mother, who I haven't seen for a long time. It's the pandemic, and I just was catching up with her. I mean, I had a few things I wanted to talk about. She had told me ages ago that she used to enjoy dressing up as an old man when she was a kid, and I was interested in this and what that was. And there is a kind of an analysand kind of vibe to the thing, but that she remains this voice without artificial representation. And then there's me, who is rendered into this stock, weird man, but trying to do that as forensically, as carefully as possible.
So just because the man is a kind of off-the-shelf avatar.
Yeah.
So in a way, what's important is, because you mentioned this idea of that this is a documentary, in a way, but it's lensless. So it's like, it's quite hard, I think, in a way, to get your head around it, that in a way there's nothing has in a way passed through a camera lens directly for this to happen, that it's like your body movements on this phone, as you make a phone call, have been tracked.
Yeah.
And that's then used to articulate, in a way, a kind of puppet.
Yeah. It's called blend shapes. So, for example, the dots that I would have drawn on my face would correspond with dots that would be positions on the puppet, this figure. So, for example, every part of my face would have different dots on, and then they would correspond with ones on the figure, to try and get it to very accurately do me. You know, it would be like wearing a really extraordinary mask. Yeah, I mean, this moment of, this is me actually just drinking from a glass, but we didn't track the glass, for example. There's no footage of the glass, so it's just this empty nothing in a hand that is, I was wearing these really awkward gloves which map my fingers. But exactly what Mike's saying is, like, there's no camera involved. So it's not a visual process of documenting something, but it's extra forensic in its relationship to the body, you know, in that it's sensing all of that. I mean, other than, there's the microphone, of course, and the recording of the phone, but the rest of it, you know, after the fact, you can do this live event, and then you have this data set, and then you can decide what you want to do with it. How do you want it to look? You know, and it's its own economy where I have to storyboard this very precisely, because it costs per second.
because you mentioned Lord of the Rings, but you're working in a way with a company that actually, I think, did like Mimic in Berlin, like a world-leading company doing motion capture. So in a way, normally the whole point of this technology is that they would track your motions in order to make you a giant orc or something spectacular. So in a way, there's something very perverse about all of this machinery that's used to kind of just put your sitting body into the body of a kind of generic other sitting white man.
Exactly, and I mean, there's a faith involved in this, which is that I have to believe, and I do believe, that in that gap, that sense of like the obscenity of doing this in a way, and the absurdity of it, opens up some kind of perspective on the conversation, on the body, on the performance of, you know, the way I speak to my mother is not how I speak right now with you or with anyone else. Everyone has a perspective on intimacy, I suppose, would be the kind of broad umbrella of it, which opens up because of this, obscenity in a way.
And it is, I should say, I mean, I'm sorry we're not able to show you more of it, but it's an extremely moving piece of work. And I think it's also, like you know, we saw a little bit at the, I don't know if you could catch it, but the beginning, you know, where your mother is talking about, in a way, these childhood experiences of taking on kind of avatar role, of like role-playing of different bodies. So there's something through the whole work that makes the viewer like acutely conscious of those, of their own body, but also this kind of aching gap between the avatar and the voice that we can hear that's, you know, like you said, you're awkward as an interviewer. There's a lot of pausing and ums and ers, which are replicated
lots of
in...
sorries.
And lots of sorries, yeah.
That's the British thing. But also, you know, it became a work in a way about inheritance and about how like my mother is. I mean, she ends up mainly talking about her mother and talking about disappointment and worrying about her mother and their relationship. And of course, you know, it's constantly affirmed that her voice has that tinny feeling of being on the phone. So she's a long way away. So there are also all kinds of distances in this thing. The distance between, say, my body in a hotel room doing this, and then my mother being a long way away, and then her mother obviously being dead. And this kind of, what emerges in a way is an inheritance of relations, of forms of relation with loved ones, with mothers, I suppose, in a way, you know. But a lot of it was inadvertent to a certain extent. You know, I let her sort of lead the conversation to a certain extent, you know. I did script it a tiny bit like, tell me about dressing up as an old man, and then tell me about your mother, you know, which is obviously a Freudian kind of cliche, you know. But it became a really, and the final work that we'll look at as well is a kind of the next thing of this kind of desire to fantasize this technology as a kind of new form of documentary to a certain extent, and that the artifice itself is exposing, you know, that using something so obviously artificial and broken is a way to, again, allegorize or metaphorize the contents of what's happening. So it's always important with each of these that they feel holistic. You know, it's not like arbitrarily applying these things, but this kind of fantasy of, okay, and obviously over years and years of using this kind of technology, you get to know it very well and what it's good at and what it's not, and what is the central thing. And in a way, previous works before all this is much more complicated and full of fireworks and special effects and things. But actually this zoning in on the kind of the nub of what's really happening here, what performance capture technology is, what is it capturing, what is it not capturing, you know, and how to speak to that in some way, you know.
And I think it's been, again, if we had more time, but performance capture has been such a kind of important thread through your work. So you had a project for the Manchester Festival, for example, where audience members could come and be part of performing a kind of a single piece of work, but different bodies were animating the avatar through a motion capture process. Yeah. And again, what that exposes a lot is, like you say, what it doesn't capture. So those movements are very jerky. There's something in a way, you get a sense of the person behind it precisely from how they don't appear, like through the...
Exactly, that sense of the withheld, you know, like the unavailability of the source it generates a kind of frustration that is very productive, I think, at least emotionally, and kind of, it's immediately recognizable, I think. You know, even though it's so heavy-handed and theatrical and ridiculous, it has this central thing that perversely it can access. I think that maybe, for example, an often asked question at the very beginning of making this was like, why didn't you just film yourself talking to your mum? You know, which of course misses all of the things, but it's interesting because it kind of triggers, well, what is all of this technology doing psychologically and emotionally to what are essentially live and precarious lived situations, you know? Yeah.
I mean, there's lots. I'd love to talk more about this. I wonder if we should just move to the third piece, though, because I think it develops a lot that was in this work, but with as you were saying, like a whole different level of kind of verisimilitude and uncanniness. And so maybe should we just watch the first couple of minutes?
Yes. Can we have the volume up again on this one? this is called Piano Work 2. Just before I start it, context. What was this made for? This was just made, actually. I don't think it was made for a specific commission, but was really a desire to progress what was already happening in that previous work, The Worm, which incidentally is called The Worm because my mother sort of euphemistically calls her depression the worm. Anyway, this is called Piano Work 2, and essentially it's very basic. It's me performing a composition by a Swiss-German composer called Jörg Frey, who wrote these sort of very, I guess, post-minimalist compositions, which are incredibly simple, but very, very difficult to play. And they're difficult to play because they really put the onus back on the body, not in terms of intellectual or technique or capability or learning, but focus and presence and immanence and all of these things. Anyway, it's called Piano Work 2.
Yep.
Maybe we can talk over it without turning the volume down too much, but yeah. I mean, this is born out of a desire for this liveness, this feeling of like, set up all of this stuff, book this team, and it is a team of people that's required to capture all of this. So again, I'm wearing a full kind of very unflattering lycra onesie and covered in sensors and this very heavy, actually at this point it's an iPhone in front of my face because the iPhones have a depth camera which basically measures, can record the 3D sort of up to a certain point.
What it uses for the face lock.
Yeah, exactly. And these ridiculous gloves which are covered in sort of big bits of plastic. And then including like foot sensors. I mean, it's one of the most embarrassing but also awfully restrictive things you could possibly wear. But the gambit, the bet in a way is, okay, I'm going to play this once. So I sorted all this out and knew I wanted to play this thing. practiced it a little bit, but mainly the piece is about counting. So each of those chords, they're on a very specific metronome beat, which I'm counting. So between chords at the beginning, it's about, it varies between like 35 to 40 seconds. There's a bit in the middle where there are 468 versions of the same chord played over and over again. It's very internal and kind of excruciating to play. But yeah, it was important for me that it was about performance. It was about, I do this once, we record it once, and then I go, and that's it. And it was a real, so there's a lot of stress involved in that, and a lot of anxiety of like, you know, it's expensive to sort all this stuff out. And it was important, though, to kind of think of it like this. Think of it like a one-off event.
A recital.
Yeah, a recital for the technology, in a way. And believing in and knowing that the technology can capture certain things. And then afterwards I can choose all the camera angles, I can choose everything. I mean, the big break in this one, in a way, was like finally having a scan done of my head and hands. And using that, trying to have something.
I think it's really worth saying.
Yeah, sorry.
No, because I think exactly on that someone asked actually just before the talk who'd seen this footage, you know, is that you? Like, is that really, is some of that photographic, and it has that quality? But the hands and the head are scanned, but the body is still generic, right? So it's actually, there's something, as real as this looks, it's actually like a Frankenstein of different elements that are kind of pieced together. So the body is like the body we saw in the previous video, like a kind of off-the-shelf.
Yeah, the shoes are just off the shelf. I think that you can get them from Dr. Martin's website, you know. The earrings are just from, there's a website, there's many websites like this, but there's a website called Turbo Squid that I use quite a lot. You can basically find a 3D model of anything you could possibly imagine, all the way down to really specific things. But yeah, the body was like an off-the-shelf, very muscular man, and we had to kind of do various things to it to make it seem like it could be my body, that this precise head would fit on top of. But you can see already, you know, like the mouth, it's very hard, the way that every muscle is working. So however accurate it is, it's still failing to do it, but in a beautiful way, in a kind of very satisfying way, I think.
And maybe, because I'm also aware of time, I think we need to open up questions soon, but I do want to ask you just about that, maybe to finish, that there's something, and I think Ben Lerner, the novelist, wrote a really beautiful piece for the New York Review of Books about this, and one of the things he did that was interesting was he made this association between piano and pain, this kind of anagrammatic relationship. And again, it's actually, for a piece that is wordless and is really just a documentation of a piano recital, it's a very emotionally charged, it's a very moving piece. But there is something even more focused, I think, in this one, in the kind of micro expressions that are passing across the face of someone who is in a state of deep concentration, but maybe also an emotional state. And the sense that, I mean, at least for me, that some of them the technology is capturing, and some of them I can see them not being captured. And that is somehow, for me, I think what gets. But can you just talk about that? About how much is this what you imagined in terms of, like, you know, when you were starting the process? Like, is it?
I mean, I don't really imagine it so much. There's more of like a happening and then deal with it.
Right.
But the weird thing is, obviously, I didn't see any of this until after I told them every shot, every movement, everything, and then it goes away, and then we, you know, there are certain, like my teeth there on the lips, really weird, and then, you know, or like, but also like asking the camera, like there are points where the little finger there playing that actually passes into the key, you know, and I don't know, my teeth are not my teeth, you know. Those are off-the-shelf teeth. They're much better than, my teeth are terrible. These are pretty good teeth. But, you know, and also like but it has this weird, you know, I don't know, personally I don't have a great relationship with how I look. So looking at this thing has this really grotesque fascination to it as well. There's something profoundly narcissistic in this experiment. But but it has this very satisfying self-alienation to it, you know, like, thank God, finally I'm not me, or something. You know, there's a kind of like a joy in it. Maybe we could turn the volume up just a tiny bit so we can hear this. This is the 468 of the same note. Oh, the sync between the sound and image isn't great. That's probably my video, but anyway, it is precise, and it's.
And maybe just to say one more thing, which is just to loop it back to the beginning, which is this is still being built in the same game engine that we saw at the beginning. And in a way, if you had infinite resources, this could be as variable as that. I guess you could make it so that this avatar could play anything if you had infinite resources. But what we're seeing is something that's the product of this is an incredibly complex and expensive thing to produce at this point. So it takes the form of a single linear video. But somehow that logic of that kind of infinite variations, the score is actually still somewhere lurking in the background of this.
Exactly. I think the score thing is really, I hadn't thought of it before, but I think this pointing out, because that as a kind of instruction sheet for both the software, but also for the artwork, really, you know, and in as much as a performance of a piece of scored music is returned as a kind of new found thing. That's what I'm looking for, I think. And I think that's kind of the perverse convincing of liveness to a certain extent is this kind of thing that comes back to you, broken and weird and full of mistakes that, you know, like I'm definitely thinner on the head than this.
Ed will be available for inspection afterwards. I just think on that, I'm aware of the time. We do really want to open for questions, and it is possible to pose them in Italian, and we have some very generous live translation, I think. So I don't know. I think there's a roving mic possibly also. So I think you can. Don't be shy. Please just.
Hi, hello.
Hi.
My question would be, have you documented the backstage of your works?
Yeah, only in still photographs.
So no videos?
No.
Okay.
No, and I think that became increasingly important, that this was a medium without visual origin. You know? Yeah.
And the second question I had, would you agree that it seems that we are kinder and more forgiving to the machines and codes than we are to each other?
That's interesting, right? Like I think there is the part of the attempt in this is reliant on a feeling that sentimentality, say, like the artificial creation of sentiment, is somehow easier to be moved by than real life. That, like a love song can make you cry, but I don't know, the breakup of a relationship, I don't know, I'm just trying to think of like, that there is something deliberate and manipulative about artificial construction that is kind of like it allows you, maybe, or me, definitely, access to feelings that otherwise are kind of withheld. So there is, that's part of it. I don't think it's about kind of kindness towards, because I hope that no one looks at this and thinks that's a character or that there is a backstory or anything like this. It is only in its sort of instance. But I think maybe because it's fake, you're allowed to look at it more. There's something shameless about it that allows you to look. And maybe that can circumnavigate kind of prohibitions in yourself, I think. I don't know. I'm not sure.
Hi. I have a bunch of questions, actually. The first thing that interests me is your relationship to the software. So what I'm trying to, or like what I've been thinking about is like, I have a completely different practice. I don't use any softwares of this type, really. or artificial intelligence or anything, but I've been interacting, of course, with ChatGPT a lot. And I've realized that my relationship to the artificial intelligence also changed through time, so that I became a lot more dominant with time. I didn't ask please, or I didn't say thank you anymore. Or I just realized that like my approach to it completely changed. So I was wondering how the software, I mean, it probably functions in a completely different way, I have no idea. How your relationship to the software changed through the years, I guess, or if that did something to the way that you interact with it, and if there's some kind of like, you know, like personification also that's happening in some way in this interaction.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be the first question.
Can I, because I won't remember that one if you say that.
Okay, sure.
But I think it's interesting because, well, you know, there's no part of this that is AI, there's no machine learning or anything like that. But I think that the interest of kind of power with the artificial and then the possibility of abuse, like definitely there's a feeling I've always had with like I can be very abusive towards these figures. I can ask them to do things that I wouldn't ask anyone. I would probably ask myself to do these things, but then there's a kind of masking that's possible in this, I think. But I think, yeah, it really, it makes some peculiar feeling of an ethical situation. Although, you know, at the same time, I kind of am very determinedly saying this is a kind of, it's a costume, it's a mask, it's not a thing, it's not like an AI which has the kind of questionable intelligence sort of thing. It is very deliberately put together. But yeah, there's definitely in me there's a masochistic desire that is able to be realized by having an avatar or something. You know? Yeah.
So maybe the question would be, which kind of connects to my second question about like yourself being in there.
Oh, there's me.
Yeah. Exactly. So yourself being in there, like in the last work that we just saw, versus like actually like creating characters that are in there, like, or like, so it is maybe not something you do to the software, but it is something apparently you do to yourself in some way.
Yeah.
So I was wondering about like, how do you, or like, when do you decide it has to be me? And it has to be my mother, and it has to be my story.
Oh, I see.
Versus like, oh, this is, I'm going to take this man, and it's this man, and it's the guy with the glasses, and it's the guy with the suit. Could also be anything else. So like, how do you, actually this is about characters. Like when when and how do you select a character? And when are you the character?
Well, when I'm the character is only that piece. It's the most recent thing. It's the first time I've sort of done that. Everything before is usually just what's the best model I can afford that is a white guy. Basically, who would be my stupid surrogate, you know, in this situation? Like, I'm not going to choose, I don't know, an elephant or a person of a different gender or a different identity completely. And there is a certain interest, of course, in the technology and the software's kind of homogenizing, you know, the fact that it sort of flattens nuance. Like Mike was saying, like there are things that it does not pick up on. And, you know, a problem with a lot of motion capture hardware is that it's very good with white skin, you know, with Caucasian skin, but not very good with anything else. So there's this already kind of problematic situation. But that's kind of encountered in the notion, at least to me, of rendering, of like something being squeezed and essentialized into a new form. So of course, hopefully, I am more nuanced than a CG model in myself. And the way that I talk to my mother or our relationship, or all of these things are far more intricate. And part of it is the kind of violence that is contained within the rendering itself, you know, like of like, taking something alive and beautiful and strange and specific and making it kind of general, and the terms with which it tries to be realistic do not include the idiosyncrasies, they include only this kind of strictness of like, well, everyone's eyebrows do this, everyone's nose does this, you know, all of these things that become deterministic. And then that's where it's interesting to try and break it, of course, is to make it fail, to prove, not prove like it's a political sort of position necessarily, but to make it fail, because underscoring its inability is just as interesting as showing how, hey, how hasn't technology gotten good or something, you know? Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. I didn't know that you've been reviewed by my favorite novelist, so probably I'm going to read it, Ben Lerner. Yeah. My question is related to something of the related to this project, SciArt. We perfectly know what science is now, like, I don't know, a medical paper, some studies, some researches. And we perfectly know what art is, Mona Lisa. We all know that this is art. But I'm more interested in the border. Something that from science, like in this case, technology, became art. When we can call it art, or when it remains a video game, or some experiment, as you call it, of technology, of coding something that became a background of a video game.
Well, I don't really know, but I think for me it's about the desire of what you want it to do. I suppose that would be a kind of key starting thing. Like, what are you asking it to do? I mean, you know, maybe it's quite a sort of old-fashioned, maybe sort of slightly modernist thing. Is that a first attempt is to kind of break it, work out how it fails, and move towards that to a certain extent. But that sounds too. It's not about good or bad, you know. It's not. I suppose, like if it was not art, maybe it would just feel like a tech demonstration at like a tech trade fair or something, where you're like, whoa, it's really good at facial capture, you know, whatever. And then what, you know, and then how it's used. I suppose that's a big jump, you know. Also, I think, you know, the purview of a video game is to be playable. That's a big one. and also to like to appeal to a lot of people, to be interactive in all kinds of different ways. I'm personally not interested in making anything interactive. I'm interested in a much more kind of direct thing, I suppose, that I can really control. Yeah, I couldn't possibly ascertain the limits of what makes something art or what doesn't. But for me, it's often a kind of perversion. There's a slightly kind of like a peculiar relationship to something. I mean, you know, like I'm not very interested in new technology that is bleeding edge new. Like if someone says, like, I've often been asked if I'd make a virtual reality thing. But the trouble with virtual reality is first and foremost, it's a virtual reality thing. You know, like the first thing you hit, and it's the first thing you remember about it. It feels like it's about the technology. Whereas there's something in this stuff that is inching towards over familiar, or sort of like, I know what this is. And that familiarity can, for me, sort of create interesting sort of breaks. You know, you can really fuck with it then. You can sort of, you can know the thing, and not fall into the trap of just making something novelty or innovative in the kind of tech positive nonsense. You know, like there can be the space for critical relationship somehow with a tool, you know. Which that's not a criteria of art making, but that's maybe part of my own criteria, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think maybe there's time for one more if there is one.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Ed. and thank you, Mike, for the talk, first of all. And I wanted to ask you, how do you work with sound?
Yeah.
Because I have kind of a feeling also through what I read that maybe the sound is the most real thing in your work somehow. And so I was curious if you can talk a little bit about that. Also, music is so central in many pieces, and
I mean, this is it's a whole another 4 hours or something. But I think it's sort of the most important part of it, in so many ways. You know, that like working on an animation without sound is to work with something that feels airless and dead. It's sound that animates, really, in the end. That's the thing that lends weight and presence, and it's the way that the world reports itself to us. And you know, if we're fortunate enough to be able to hear, there is this kind of sense that, I mean, I'm sorry if it's sort of garbled, but like, sound is something that lands in your head as waves, and your inner ear vibrates at the same frequency as the thing you're hearing. So there is this very physical, bodily thing that sound does that visual does not, you know. Also, you can close your eyes, but you can seldom close your ears. And so, it's full of incident. Like right now I can hear, this is now to get all sort of John Cagey, but like you can hear the air conditioning over there, you can hear someone talking slightly, or you can hear the interpreter but just whispering, you know. You can hear all these things that are not intentional, and you cannot get rid of them. And so they are also the kind of location of reality somehow. If you were to try and make a hierarchy of these things, which is silly, but you know. And so it was an early decision of mine was to not fuck with the sound, but also to start adding sounds like bits of Foley that emphasize physicality and add weight and presence, you know, all these things. So I think it's, and then music that's also the kind of the unquestioned shortcut to emotion in a way. You know, it's the thing that is somehow allowed a free pass without interrogation into a kind of sentiment, you know. So wanting that, I mean, previous works, I'm not actually playing it on the thing, but still, yeah.
I was just thinking, to Papa, that there's a famous book that the philosopher Theodor Adorno wrote with Hans Eisler, this composer, and there's about composing for films. And one of the interesting things that they say, because they're writing in the 30s, is that the problem for them with cinema in the 30s is that the images are completely unreal because they're two-dimensional and they're black and white. So no one thinks that Cary Grant is Cary Grant, but the sound is in a way real. Yeah. Like the sound has this naturalistic, so there's that gap is what creates that. And in a way, although we're in this, you know, technologically generations on from that, there is still something, like you say, with virtual reality. There's no way you have that naturalistic experience of a virtual space that you do of a sound, even a Foley sound.
Exactly.
And that gap somehow seems like your work is really inhabiting that gap a lot.
There was so much, I mean, there was a kind of joke between me and Lecky about this low pass filter I would put on loads of things, which basically made sounds sound like they were coming from the neighbor's apartment. Because it has this sort of sense of like the off-screen, the off-screen world, and this sort of constant heckling of the real outside of vision. You know, your vision has this limit, but the sound does not. I mean, it does in volume, but there is this sort of spatialized thing which is worrying, and it cannot be confirmed necessarily. So there is this sort of, and again, I think, the disjunct between a kind of unmediated recording of my voice and then this massively mediated figure in The Worm, say, or in lots of other works and stuff, again, is another opportunity for this chasm of real and not, you know. But I think, I mean, I don't know. I'm immediately thinking of Singing in the Rain, the kind of introduction of the talkie. But I think it was a big moment for me. I mean, the very first video stuff I'm making was to sound. It was like this desire to try and make a video really opaque and thick. So every cut would have a sound. It's this kind of structural tendency of like trying to report the truth of what's happening, so you don't ever fall into hey, it's just, it's just montage or whatever, but actually you're left with this kind of like thing that's constantly saying, it's almost like a sort of pedagogic thing of like, now this, Pavlovian thing, I don't know what I'm talking about now, but yeah. Ok.
Bene, vorrei chiedere un bel applauso per Ed e Mike per questa interessante conversazione. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
E vi ricordo che adesso abbiamo un piccolo aperitivo dove potete mangiare e bere qualcosa e continuare a fare le vostre domande ai nostri relatori. Grazie ancora a tutti per la partecipazione e a dopo.
Grazie.